If I asked you to name the first wasteful, misguided, and ill conceived American war that came to mind, it's more than likely you'd immediately name the War on Terror. By now, we all know it not only cost the US trillions of dollars, but it also took millions of lives, mostly civilian, while devastating the countries it touched Iraq and Afghanistan primarily, but also Yemen, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and more. The impact of these wars cannot be understated. Recently, I read reports of Iraqi birth defects from toxic chemicals leached into the environment that are so prevalent, doctors are asking parents to stop having children. What if I told you there was another US war that ended 50 years ago this month that laid the groundwork for America's global war on terror? The OG modern forever war, if you will. I'm talking about the Vietnam War. Yeah, you ready to jump in, brother? Historian Andrew Bacevich, who I'll be speaking with later, refers to the 56-year-long period from America's entry into Vietnam in 1965 to its withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 as one very long war. Neither conflict was vital to U.S. national security. Both blindly trusted new military technologies to simply obliterate their way to victory. Neither had clear objectives, yet we still lost both. And for what? Well, as Bacevich explains, both wars were undergirded by the same confused logic. They were what Bacevich calls wars of choice, thought to defend the fraught notion of American exceptionalism.
If freedom is to survive in any American hometown, it must be preserved in such places as South Vietnam. And as President Johnson has pointed out, it is up to us.
If you followed the global war on terror, you might remember this image from August 2021, an American Chinook helicopter hovering over the U.S. Embassy in Kabul as Taliban forces surrounded the city moments before they retook the capital and what we now call the fall of Kabul. The image captures America's 20-year-long folly in Afghanistan perfectly. The helicopter isn't just retreating, it's leaving the country worse off than it found it. If America's goal was eliminating the Taliban, we failed. If the goal was bringing the American way of life to the Middle East, we instead brought untold civilian casualties, mass displacement, the return of Taliban rule, and environmental collapse. But what's most striking about this image is how eerily similar it is to another taken 50 years earlier. On April 29, 1975, Dutch journalist Herbert van Es captured what would perhaps become the most iconic image of the Vietnam War. Though if you're under 50 years old, you may never have seen it. Van Es's camera looks up at a CIA-owned American Air helicopter perched atop an incongruously placed, almost haphazard-looking structure on the roof of what many first believed was the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, but was actually an apartment building used by the CIA and other U.S. operatives. The apartment and its strange rooftop addition tower above the area's rusting tin roof structures, some unidentifiable ramshackle wooden construction, and even the gnarled and twisting tree line below. But what's most remarkable is the desperate throng of Vietnamese people, many of whom had worked for the US government, forming a tight-knit serpentine line, all frantically attempting to board the too small escape chopper. This frenzied snapshot of America's turbulent retreat came to epitomize a widely criticized war that, by 1975, had claimed over 58,000 American lives and between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, most of them civilians. And while the story of how we reached the point of the helicopter retreat from Kabul is somewhat well known, you may not know the parallels to the Vietnam War, a conflict similarly fought without clear objectives in a country that, likewise, didn't obviously pose any real threat to American safety.
American forces in Vietnam know that the communists' so-called War of Liberation is no less a form of aggression than was the conventional attack in Korea. And they know that this new form of aggression must be defeated and proven unprofitable, or the communists will be encouraged to try it elsewhere with greater confidence and resources.
If you even just take a moment to really think about how we got to Vietnam and the narrative we've been told, it kind of falls apart. Would communism anywhere really threaten capitalism here? Did it endanger American lives? No, but war certainly does. The Vietnam War highlighted a profound problem with American warfare and foreign policy, how undemocratic U.S. wars had become. This dynamic would give birth to what's known as Vietnam syndrome, a general suspicion and distaste among everyday Americans regarding U.S. intervention abroad. Much of this criticism stemmed from the war's absurdity. Why fight an ideological battle using citizen soldiers as cannon fodder? But also from the deluge of horrific images appearing on American television screens, newspapers, and magazines day after day after day. Artists quickly highlighted this visual disruption of the status quo. Take, for example, the photo montage Balloons by Martha Rosler from her collection House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home. An immaculately clean and staged living room interior is interrupted by a cutout of a Vietnamese woman holding a bloodied child. Ripped from the chaos of war, the woman and child now stare out with expressions of profound shock and terror, forcibly inserted into the artificial perfection of an upper middle class home. Festive balloons cluster against the wall, symbolic remnants of a carefree celebration that serve as both counterpoint and accusation. The visual parallel is devastating. By forcing these traumatized figures into collision with American domestic comfort, Rosler explores their radical otherness. Their encroachment into the banality of American life at home becomes an indictment. They are unwelcome intruders, forcing the horrors of a foreign war into the consciousness of unwitting participants. And this is super important because artists like Rosler and the photojournalists capturing images like the one cut out and delivered here are intended to jolt the viewer out of her complacency. But the grim reality is that ordinary citizens like you and me lack the power to actually end wars. That's because U.S. foreign policy is anti-democratic by design. A war's popularity or unpopularity, and make no mistake, Vietnam was deeply unpopular, especially by the 1970s. But that doesn't determine whether or not the U.S. government will continue or discontinue a war. That's not to say that these mass protest movements and cultural condemnations had no effect. They did. They effectively ended the draft, meaning those who join the U.S. Armed Forces today are no longer selected by a randomized system, but are part of an increasingly professionalized job. But as we'll discuss in a moment with Andrew Bacevich, ending the draft, perhaps confusingly, actually just made it easier for elites to wage endless and unnecessary wars. All right. That's it for my monologue. Let's talk to Mr. Alex Jordan before we bring Bacevich onto the line.
It seems ironic that while our finest young men are fighting halfway across the world, other young men and women, safe at home, openly advocate abandonment of Vietnam to communism. Perhaps they really don't know what this war is all about.
Look at this one I sent you called Red Stripe Kitchen.
Wow.
So this is another image from the Vietnam War. It really looks like those two American soldiers are like in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And
searching.
Yeah, they're searching. It's like the war, like it's almost like funny. Like,
yeah, they're raiding the cabinets in a very grim
funny.
way.
I thought it was interesting that they chose to kind of leave all the accoutrement for cooking and baking out, as if like the woman presumably working in had just stepped out, and as she stepped out, like these kind of Vietnam soldiers have like snuck in through the hallway.
Your life is not interrupted by the soldiers like searching your village for enemy forces or whatever. It came into your house through the television. And you could turn that on and off.
Something, even when you know something horrific is happening, like we do almost every year in America. America's doing something horrific.
We just like bombed like dozens of Yemenis to death like within the last 2 weeks.
Right. So there's these, constant like deadly campaigns that the US is constantly carrying out or tacitly carrying out or not stopping, whatever. And we can know all of this, right? It can be like seeped into our veins, and yet still, right? Like it's like this kind of almost dreamlike passiveness, like my life continues, and what else can you do, right? Like,
yeah, I would love to go to the second photo that you sent.
oh God, you're not. Yeah, please.
Because I think it's to your question of like, what can you do?
So this is, so basically Rosler, from what I can tell, she takes like a break after the Vietnam War, and she picks this series back up with the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Her rationale, if I was to push her, I assume would be like to highlight how we're consuming media, which is very different. Notice how like the two girls sitting on like the Eames chair, and I can't tell what the other chair is from over here, are behind her, and so is the explosion. I think that's like almost like old media. That's the newspapers. One of them is literally cut from a newspaper and magazines, and so she's consuming the media through social media, maybe like early iterations of social media on her phone.
She has the ability to see everything in front of her, and she is still choosing to ignore it. So it's like, it's not even that it's just the two soldiers enter your house at 7 p.m. when you watch the news. It's like this digital age brings the costs of Americans' wars like with great immediacy, and still like this person is able to disconnect and disengage from the reality in front of them.
I think what's, striking about them, right, is this continuation from Vietnam to the global war on terror, right? Like even Rosler sees, what Bacevich, will hear him call a very long war,
right?
This 56-year long period. It's like, what has changed? No, we're still, nothing. We're still fighting these pointless, deadly, catastrophic wars.
Alrighty, folks. Always at War Team is very excited to be joined today by our friend and colleague, Andrew Bacevich. Andy is the co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he now serves as Quincy's emeritus board chair. Andy is also the professor emeritus of international relations and history at Boston University. He's a graduate of West Point. Andy is a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, and he served as a platoon leader in Vietnam in 1970 and 1971. So very relevant to our conversation today. But most importantly, Andy is a wise and good dude. He is an unflinching critic of America's disastrous foreign policy record. We're just thrilled to have him on. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much, Andy. Okay, so my kind of first, like, as I started kind of doing my first bits of research for this, I think I read a lot of what you wrote. I've read a lot about it, what other people have written about the Vietnam War. And I think what I kept coming back to is I do understand, like, on the surface level or what was told to the American people is about, what the Vietnam was quote unquote really about. And that's like, this domino theory of communism. We've got to, nip it in the bud. But I keep feeling like I'm missing something here, because it's really just hard for me to wrap my head around how, I think 60,000 Americans died in that war against an ideology. And that's like not to mention the millions of Vietnamese people. So what am I missing here? Can you help me better understand like how we got to this point and set the stage a little bit for like what brought us to this war?
An excellent question, which I won't be able to answer. Because I myself today can't understand why we sent all those U.S. troops to fight for this almost artificial country, the Republic of Vietnam. Why we stayed that long, despite the costs. And I myself today, as a participant, today say, for what? Now, if I crank back to where I was at the end of the 1960s, meaning a young man who grew up in the milieu of Cold War America, then I can kinda, sorta reconstruct or recapture the rationale. I don't buy it, but nonetheless, I can recall it. And I think you touched on some of the key points. The most important of which was the way that anti-communism, itself an ideology, gripped the country beginning in the late 1940s. And anti-communism really was, in many respects, indistinguishable from antagonism toward the Soviet Union, toward Soviet allies, to include briefly the People's Republic of China. Now, how old were you guys at 9/11?
Yeah, I was 10.
10.
I was 11.
11. Okay, then probably you were too young even for this point. When 9/11 happened, this incredible shock, this appalling attack on our own country, killing thousands of our countrymen, the American people were instantly gripped by an enormous fear. And I would argue that the Bush administration and its allies seized upon that fear to implement something called the global war on terrorism, leading to the invasion of Iraq and leading to all kinds of other consequences. I don't know how you two feel, but already for me, in retrospect, I say, what the hell did we think we were doing after 2001, leading to all the myriad consequences? Well, that's the question in a sense that applies to 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950, in the early stages of the Cold War. The country was gripped by a fear of communism, and the leading figures in the foreign policy establishment, not necessarily cynically, but nonetheless seized upon this moment to reorient U.S. foreign policy in a way that, among other things, produced its sustained and I think permanent militarization. And it's kind of one of these things. If you weren't there, it's hard to understand. If you weren't paying attention at the time of 9/11, it's hard to understand how we end up invading Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. So again, it comes down, I think, to anti-communism, reinforced by an intense suspicion and dislike of Russia and the Soviet Union that kind of came together after World War II, which was a moment of triumphalism, and that created an environment which produced the Cold War and then subsequently produced this determination to intervene in Vietnam and with all the consequences.
The threat of a communist takeover in South Vietnam will be eliminated, and peace with freedom and the right of self-determination will be won for its people.
We fought World War II just as we had fought World War I, just as we had fought the Civil War, with a citizens' army. I say army, navy, ultimately Air Force, meaning we raised up military forces for a specific purpose. We raised up military forces beginning around 1940 in order to take on Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It was a conscript force. Soldiers were conscripted for the duration. That was the phrase. Because the expectation of American citizens was, when the war ends, all these soldiers are going to go home, and the U.S. would revert to a military posture that was actually quite modest. Now, this expectation gets overturned in the immediate post-World War II period because of the onset of the Cold War, and I must say, in a sense, reinforced or affirmed by the war in Korea. You know, the war we seldom talk about. World War II ends in 1945. Cold War sort of begins to crank up 1946, 1947, 1948. North Korea invades the South in 1950. And this then is the stimulus for rearmament, for the emergence of a political consensus, Democrats and Republicans alike, that the United States, from this point forward, from 1950 forward, must maintain large forces in being, prepared to fight the communists. The difference, I think, with the end of the Cold War is that despite, you mentioned it, despite there's a certain amount of chit-chat about a peace dividend, it was never really very serious. The political establishment, I'm talking about people in Washington, but I'm also talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, never seriously considered reverting to a pre-World War II military posture, because at the end of the Cold War, this was the end of history moment in which the United States was destined to maintain a position of global hegemony from now until the end of time, and global hegemony required a dominant military force. So in that sense, what happens after 1945 and what happens after 1989 are substantially different.
One thing that really stands out, and I'm sorry to bring us back, I feel like I'm just missing something a little bit, but like World War II, that's what, 4 or 5 years, right, where that the U.S. is deployed. We're talking about
1941, 1945, basically. Yeah,
like that. I mean, compared to Vietnam, Iraq, those are 20-something year wars. I think Vietnam 20 years, Iraq, who knows how long we were there, till like yesterday.
Still going, yeah.
How, like, that's a big difference. That's a huge jump in just time at war.
Excellent question. And this goes back to the issue of the composition of the United States military. As we said, World War II is fought with a citizen army. You know, my parents, both my parents, served in the war. People my age, the boomer generation, so many of us, our parents served during the war it becoming really a formative event in their lives. Right? One of the consequences of the Vietnam War, let me back up a second, and therefore the Korean War is fought with a citizen army. And therefore, the Vietnam War is fought with a citizen army. You know, famously, a draft army, conscripts. Not every soldier was drafted, but nonetheless, a very substantial number of soldiers in 65, 66, 67 are draftees. And they are the heirs of this citizen soldier concept which had existed in prior wars. But the Vietnam War turns out to be so controversial, members of my generation, and this is the point when my generation is in college and worried about getting drafted and asking questions about what the heck is this war all about? I don't want to go there, leads to a powerful impetus among the American people to abandon the citizen soldier concept. I mean, at that time the replacement is called the all-volunteer army. I don't think that phrase is much in use anymore, but I think we've become comfortable with the notion that it's a professional military. Really, conscription, a draft, has become unimaginable. Now, President Nixon is probably more responsible for abandoning the citizen army and creating the professional army than any other individual, because he's the guy who ended the draft during the latter part of the Vietnam War. Why did he do that? Probably for completely cynical reasons, because he calculated that if I do away with the draft, then these sons of bitchin' college kids will get out of the streets and quit protesting and get back in class where they belong. And therefore, I, the president, will have more latitude to run foreign policy the way I want to. All right? So we end the draft, we create this professional military, and I think the American people have become enormously comfortable with it. And why are they comfortable? Because there are virtually no costs that the citizen has to pay. The people who serve are volunteers. They're doing that because they want to do it. And although the professional army has turned out to be really expensive, I mean, if you look at the Pentagon's budget, citizens don't really pay because it's all funny money. It's all deficit spending. It's all red ink. And therefore, I think today we have a citizenry that has become very comfortable cheering for the troops, having flybys at the beginning of the football game, all that kind of stuff, having, patriotic TV shows on the 4th of July, singing patriotic songs, saying yay troops, but in part because there's no cost. And therefore, when the people in charge embark upon the wars, as you just suggested, that go on and on and on, there's very little opposition. Indeed, there's not a heck of a lot of questions. To me, the classic current case, I don't know the numbers, but we've got a couple thousand U.S. soldiers that are still in Iraq and are in Syria, of all places.
Yeah.
Why are they there? What are they doing? Nobody knows. Nobody cares. And I think that is a very small illustration of what has happened, how American civil-military relations have been transformed since we moved away from a citizens' army to a professional army.
It strikes me as contradictory. Look, I've just been steeped in Vietnam, okay, the last few days, okay? I'm steeped in Vietnam. I'm reading about Vietnam, and what keeps coming up is Vietnam syndrome, right? This, right. Okay, reluctance amongst Americans to continue this, unending engagement. And I think polls reflect, right? The people don't really want to be constantly engaged abroad, but it continues apace. It seems like nothing has really changed. In fact, you argue that from the beginning of the Vietnam War to basically today, the Vietnam War is in some ways just a long war, and Vietnam syndrome is just a vibe.
Yes and no. In my judgment, there's no question there was a Vietnam syndrome. The essence of the Vietnam syndrome was, we don't want no more Vietnams. We don't want any more long wars involving large numbers of U.S. ground troops that result in significant American casualties. That's what the Vietnam syndrome demands that whoever's in Washington avoids. And they've done so. Yes, we have these long, drawn-out, ambiguous, what the heck are we trying to do, conflicts. But U.S. casualties have tended to be relatively low. I'm not dismissing them as of no significance, but they have not. For a little while during the Iraq War, U.S. casualties were reaching the threshold where anti-war sentiment was growing, but only briefly. But if you look at the pattern, so here we are a country permanently at war. Let's just posit that. If you look at sort of the graph of U.S. military casualties in this permanent war, it's really relatively low on a historical basis. Much lower than Vietnam, much lower than Korea, much lower than the World Wars, God knows, much lower than the Civil War, because of the way we've designed our forces. One of the reasons why the Vietnam War was fought the way it was, let's send 500,000 troops to Southeast Asia, was because at that time, in a sense, the military profession's mental model of warfare said that you win wars on the ground. At some point in the conflict, you need to attack the hill, seize the hill, and get the enemy to wave a flag of surrender. That was, in a sense, simplified, but the image of warfare. That image has gone away. What's the image that prevails today? Two things. Number one, airplanes. Airplanes bombing, probably, maybe with precision munitions, but nonetheless with death raining from above. More recently, probably there's no pilot up there because drones have become a very common instrument for delivering the munitions. So there's the air dimension, and then what's going on the ground? Well, it's not the GIs of World War II. It's not the draftees of Vietnam. It's highly trained, very specialized troops. SEALs seems to be the contingent that the media is most interested in. Elite forces, small numbers, of course, volunteers, and mostly operating in complete secret. We don't know where they are or what they're doing, and therefore, again, the American people on the sidelines, not asked to sacrifice, and that facilitates conducting wars that just go on and on and on.
So Washington effectively succeeded in lowering the political cost of being at war.
Absolutely. And I mean, we say Washington, and this, first of all, it's a bipartisan, we don't have an anti-war party, We have two pro-military parties who don't seriously inquire into what the military is doing. And we also have a professional force that has become, I would argue, very comfortable with this arrangement. Back in World War II, conscript army, soldiers, you're drafted and you're told you are in for the duration. Nobody tells you, and oh, by the way, that's only going to be until 1945. It could have been until 1946, could have been until 1948. You're in for the duration. Military leaders, most prominently George C. Marshall, who was the Army Chief of Staff and a truly great American, feared that the American people would not stand for a long war. He was worried that Americans would say, we've had enough. We're not going to send more troops to Germany to fight against the Nazis. We want this thing to end, which made Marshall himself very, concerned about the level of casualties. And again, those calculations, I think, no longer exist. And it's not that the people running the armed services are enthusiastic about having casualties, but it's just it's not the same kind of consideration that I think it once was.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're telling us is like paradoxically, like ending the draft, amongst a whole bunch of other things, just made it a lot easier
Bingo.
for the U.S. to continue
Bingo.
waging these
Absolutely.
wars. And, you know, speaking of long, stupid wars, I guess, one thing that we kind of skipped over that I took for granted for the audience is the comparisons you've drawn, you know, again and again between Vietnam and the war in Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, what strikes me as so shocking about them is how difficult it is, right? And we've been talking about this, to pinpoint what exactly they're about.
Right.
Could you maybe just, you know, quickly explain to our audience, you know, why you see so many parallels when I don't think everyone does?
You mean between Vietnam and Iraq?
And Iraq, yeah.
With regard to Vietnam, the end game was actually never very clear. With regard to Iraq, the supposed end game was very clear, and then it changed. So, why were we fighting in Vietnam? Well, I think nominally we were fighting in Vietnam in order to enable the South Vietnamese to preserve their republic, the Republic of Vietnam. They were manifestly unable to do that against the internal opposition, against the Vietnamese opposition, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong. They needed assistance. Gradually, over a period of about 10 years, the United States provided that assistance when things were going badly, provided more when things were going badly, provided more, and then finally in 1965, in essence, the United States took over the war. We know you South Vietnamese can't handle this. Here we are to save the day. And of course, we proved unable to defeat the enemy and ultimately gave up. What happens in Iraq is, at least if you go by what the Bush administration was saying publicly, I emphasize that because what they were saying publicly is not what they were thinking privately, in my estimation. But what they were saying publicly is, we are going to war in Iraq. Don't tell me that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. We are going to war in Iraq because Saddam Hussein represents an enormous danger to our security and the security of the world, because he is developing nuclear weapons. And if he succeeds in that, then wow, we are all in big trouble. So we're going to invade Iraq and we're going to disarm Saddam Hussein. And oh, by the way, we're then going to create a democratic Iraq, and it will become a beacon for democracy in the Middle East. And if all goes well, what will follow will be the democratization of the rest of the region. Peace, harmony, prosperity will be the result. So we invade again with the narrowly defined purpose of overthrowing the Saddam Hussein regime and, quote unquote, disarming Iraq. That purpose is achieved rather quickly. There are no nuclear weapons, but we succeed in the regime disintegrates with minimal resistance to U.S. and coalition forces. Ta-ta! You remember the famous banner on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished. Well, I think within the Bush administration, they had a conversation that went like this. Well, what do we do now? We can't just walk away. So we're going to have to embark upon a reform program that will at least to some degree produce this liberal, stable, prosperous, democratic Iraq that we promised. Alas, an internal resistance developed that basically was based on a demand on a part of Iraqis that they wanted the Americans to get the hell out of here and let us run our own affairs. And so we end up with this long, ugly, unconventional war that we are not well equipped to handle, and you know the rest of the story.
Andy, at the beginning of this episode, we looked at the iconic photo of the fall of Saigon. Like, it seems burned in the political memory of a lot of the people who lived through the war, as much, if not more, than pictures of some of the catastrophic tolls of the war on the Vietnamese and on Cambodia and Laos and all the resulting awfulness and death and destruction. But those of us who didn't live through Vietnam, that the fall of Saigon photo may not have much resonance, but we do have like maybe a modern comparison, which is those photos of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yep. And the thing about that, it generated far more upset, the withdrawal and the chaos, than the years of the failed bloody war that preceded that withdrawal. We didn't see nearly as much upset and Sturm und Drang around all of the decades and the trillions of dollars wasted and the lives wasted. And I'm curious, how do you think about the media's role here?
So by the time of the fall of Saigon, the U.S. forces are gone. We have completely withdrawn, except a handful of security forces around the embassy. There's a lot of press coverage. Frankly, the press coverage in my memory focused on South Vietnamese forces and their families fleeing the country, trying to get away from the South before the North completely took over. So we have a lot of dramatic photos of helicopters, South Vietnamese helicopters landing on American aircraft carriers, the passengers disembarking, and U.S. naval personnel shoving the helicopters into the sea. So there was a certain amount of press coverage, but I think that my recollection, maybe not accurate, the predominant feeling was, this is very sad, but we knew this was going to happen, and now we have this damnable war done. Definitively done. And we, the American people, of course, accepting no responsibility whatsoever for what had occurred, we can now move on. The Vietnam War is in the past. The difference, I think, with the fall of Kabul was that whereas American exhaustion vis-a-vis Vietnam was great, it was not quite the same with the fall of Kabul. And therefore, the fall of Kabul ends up being politicized in ways that the fall of Saigon was not. Biden screwed up. This never would have happened if it weren't for Biden. Get Biden out of the White House, and things will prove to be much better. In other words, I think the criticism was completely cynical. I personally think that Biden made the right call. The Afghanistan war was unwinnable. We had been there for God knows how many years, and so it was time for us to allow the Afghan people to sort out their future. Staying longer wasn't going to do any good. Now, tactically speaking, the withdrawal was clearly mishandled, but in the larger scheme of history, that really was not that important. But again, for political purposes, Biden's critics, fastened on it, and we're making political hay successfully.
Well, it sounds like switching to the all-volunteer force and successfully ratcheting down Americans' experience of the military state, like investment in the sense of like that person over there is going to the war, or somebody in my family is here,
right.
Or that I might get drafted into a war, that I should, maybe care about the stated goals or whatever. It seems like they effectively reducing that buy-in from the American people via the institution of the all-volunteer force then makes our foreign policy making more susceptible to the whims of the elites who are invested in it for
Yes.
parochial reasons.
I think that is well stated. Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's a great state of affairs. Things are awesome.
Right.
Yeah, I guess this brings us kind of to some of our final questions, which is something you wrote like really stuck with both Alex and I actually, which is that Americans do not need their country's role in the world explained to them in the style of a children's bedtime story, which is like strikes me as true, right? But why is it important as a matter of history to put a nice simplifying gloss on U.S. foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's somehow unique to us. If we look at the great powers that preceded us at the pinnacle of global influence, let us cite Great Britain and let us cite France as examples, both of whom, especially the Brits, seized global empires, and brutalized the areas where they created their colonies and exploited the colonial population. So, and they don't remember it that way. The Brits want to celebrate, the empire, Queen Victoria, all that. So it's not just us. I mean, is it inherent in any great power to prefer a whitewashed chronicle of its own past in order to justify the exercise of power in the present moment? I guess I haven't studied enough world history to be able to give a definitive judgment, but yeah, I kind of think so. Powerful nations want to think well of themselves, and so I probably we're not that different in that regard.
Yeah, it's true, right? Like, do we need bedtime stories? No. Do we tell them to ourselves? Of course. Not to bring us back to the beginning of this episode, but one question I have is, what is the bedtime story we tell ourselves about wars like Vietnam and wars like Iraq? I think there was a story we told ourselves upon entering those wars, but it's unclear, maybe it would be good. Let me make a counter argument. Maybe it would be good to have a story we told ourselves about Vietnam and Iraq, because instead we've just kind of forgotten the
Well, I think the story we prefer is the story of brave young Americans who go to these far-off places, believing in freedom and democracy, and hoping through their efforts and their sacrifices to share those benefits with others. That's what we want to remember. Quite frankly, I believe the motives that our soldiers carry into battle probably tend to be other than the idealistic narrative. Matter of fact, I think there's good research on that. But that's what we the people want to think of our soldiers. I mean, one of the things that's maybe it's not related, but I think it is that we do, I think, want to remember these wars as wars of sacrifice on the part of our soldiers, and we don't pay a lot of attention, I think, to those who construct and create a rationale for the war in the first place. I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but I mean, it's striking. This is vis-a-vis Iraq, okay? It is striking to recall the journalists who were cheerleaders for going after Saddam Hussein. and who were absolutely persuaded that we were on a mission to spread democracy. And were absolutely certain that it was going to be an easy victory and was going to be a wonderful thing. And they were wrong. I'm not aware of how many of them apologized, but I know for a fact that many of them are still writing for the Washington Post and writing for the New York Times and writing for the Atlantic magazine. And you sort of say, how shameless these people must be. That's their job, I guess. But I mean, it's upsetting for somebody like me.
So, Andy, you helped to create the Quincy Institute, which is bringing everybody watching and listening this lovely podcast. Would you tell us a little bit about what you saw in D.C. Going wrong with generally U.S. foreign policy making, and what the goal was, or what you saw as valuable in building a tentpole for restraint and for changing the U.S. foreign policy approach to the world?
Well, I mean, I've been on my own intellectual journey with regard to America's role in the world and with regard to the utility of force. And that journey brought me to believe that U.S. foreign policy had become thoroughly militarized and that we had this propensity to engage in unnecessary wars. And once in them, that we also had a propensity for mismanaging those wars. And that critical voices, voices saying, pointing out the deficiencies of these inclinations were not heard. And when it was suggested to me that the foreign policy arena needed a voice in favor of restraint, not a voice in favor of isolationism. That's the smear. But in favor of restraint and in favor of engagement that was not premised on using force. That sort of entity could make a positive impact on the foreign policy debate. And I think that's what Quincy does. I think it does it brilliantly. And I got to say, as an old man, my participation in creation of Quincy is really something that I take enormous pride in, because what Quincy does is of incalculable importance.
We couldn't agree more. All right, Andy, one last question here, and I'm bringing it back to a quote I know you and I both love. It's from the inimitable Secretary Madeleine Albright in 1998 on the Today Show, in which she claimed, if we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future, and we see the danger here to all of us. So this indispensable nation idea is, I think, maybe one of the bedtime stories that persists.
Yes.
And I guess my question for you is, after, just to take one specific example, the U.S., arming to the hilt Israel's war in Gaza that has like totally destroyed Gaza and killed countless, upwards of tens of thousands. The numbers keep growing. How does something like this idea that if we have to use force, it's because we're America, we stand taller, we see further, the idea that this, we are benevolently using military force, that we know better than everybody else. How does this idea persist?
Well, it's a convenient lie. I mean, this notion of an indispensable nation was a lie when Madeleine Albright articulated it. It is fascinating to me that recently, in recent months, that phrase continues to be used in Washington circles. It's appalling, and it's difficult to understand. And that kind of language creates a barrier to our self-understanding as a nation, as a people. And it's only by giving the lie to this notion of indispensability or beneficence that we can change. And I think the events unfolding in Washington as we speak emphasize, drive home the point that we can no longer afford to indulge in the kind of the mythic self-image that has been so prominent in the way we have approached the world.
Andy, thank you so much. This was
fantastic.
Like
really amazing.
I enjoyed it. Thank you to you both.
That was awesome. What a good conversation with Andy. I couldn't think of a better person to bring on to talk about this.
I'm so thankful that he was down to come on, because after that combo, I just feel a lot smarter. Like, it really hits home coming from the mouth of Andy.
I'm trying to get listeners, let them know how much they just saved on a semester course seminar in Boston.
Oh, that's a good, thousands of dollars. Oh my gosh.
Don't say we didn't ever do anything for you.
What leads us to our rendezvous with destiny in Vietnam is our deep concern with friendly nations everywhere, whenever they face communist subversion and aggression.
Thanks for tuning in to Always at War. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. We don't want you to miss a second of all this hot truth-telling Courtney and I are dropping in your laps right here. And please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. I think it really helps people to find the show. And, we're only a few episodes in, so help us get those numbers up. If you got something to say, or like a suggestion for a future episode, something we messed up, don't tell us what we messed up. But everything else, drop in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to follow the Quincy Institute, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, we're everywhere. So just look up Quincy Inst. That's Quincy, Quincy, INST, as in Institute, Quincy Inst, to find us. And go to quincyinst.org to learn a little bit more about the work we're doing, trying to reorient U.S. foreign policy around diplomacy and engagement and not military primacy and war. All right, folks, until next time, peace.